Over the past few years, calls for Australians to learn more about their Asian neighbours have come from business, politicians and educators. The business community see our links with Asia predominantly in trade terms. The countries of our region represent vast new markets which Australia can tap. An understanding of our region needs to be broader than seeing it in terms of business opportunities. For many years, the history and rich cultural diversity of our neighbours have generally been ignored throughout the education system.
We did actually a survey 2 years ago in the end of 1991, and we asked students in Melbourne primary schools to draw their images of Asia. And when we did that 2 years ago, the drawings were incredibly simplistic. I was actually shocked at the time to see how limited their images were. They were predominantly Ninja Turtles. Most drawings were Ninja Turtles. Then we had some images of the Japanese takeover of Australia. One child, I remember, had drawn a picture of Queensland with the Japanese flag firmly implanted over that picture, and there are a number of those kinds of images. So we had Ninja Turtles, we had Japanese takeover pictures, and then we had some very stereotypical Chinese in coolie hats, and that was really all it was.
Many of the images adults have of countries in the Asian region are based on stereotyped notions from their school days, when scant attention was paid to the historical and cultural diversity of Asia. The basis of our education for most of this century has been that our culture, history and economics were firmly enmeshed with the West.
We've looked to Europe and we've looked to America, and we've said that's where literature lies, art lies, economics, politics, that's where it's important. And for some unknown reason, actually, we've ignored the great contributions of the literatures, the art, the philosophies, the religions, not to mention the economics and the politics and the geographies of our immediate neighbours. And those neighbours have rich, enormously long traditions which we can learn from. Equally with literature, with the literature that we teach in schools. We teach the literature of Australia, of course, and of England, naturally, and America. We also teach the literature in translation of the Russians, the Germans, the Norwegians even. We teach Ibsen to our students. And yet we ignore the great Japanese novelists, we ignore the beautiful tradition of Japanese poetry, we ignore increasingly exciting Indonesian literature, Malaysian literature. There's just a wealth out there that our kids have been deprived of.
Indonesian-born journalist Rati Harjono has recently written a book, The White Tribe of Asia, which aims to explain Australia to Indonesians. The book gives us an insight into the kinds of issues one of our closest neighbours wants to know about Australia.
First of all, I suppose if you take it back 5-6 years ago, Indonesians didn't want to know about Australia or felt they had no need to know about Australia, and therefore there was a vacuum on the knowledge of Australia. They didn't quite know why they wanted to know about Australia. These days there's been a great change because a lot has happened, and they're curious and interested in Australia, but the information is not there except from what I write and other journalists write. And the image is still that of a dull country, a boring country, that nothing much happens. I think the thing that sticks in the minds of a lot of Indonesians is the White Australia policy. And you still meet Indonesians that say to you, well, you know, there's the White Australia policy. And you say, well, look, that was abolished in the 60s. You know, that was 30 years ago. And really, today Australia's not like that. It's multicultural, it's this, it's that, and a whole lot of things. And they're surprised.
Asians now represent 4.5% of Australia's population, with the largest intake of migrants and refugees taking place during the 1980s. The recent Human Rights and Equal Opportunity Commission National Inquiry into Racist Violence reported many examples of Asians experiencing violence and harassment in this country. The report says there is a problem in our treatment of Asian migrants, and that this is a problem with the potential to affect us all. It suggests that legislative as well as attitudinal change is needed.
I think Australia's come a long way from my personal point of view. When I first arrived, I was just so conscious I was Asian. Although I'm half and half. I'm half Australian, half Indonesian. But I was terribly conscious about that. I was terribly conscious about the fact that English was my second language. And then I proceeded, and I remember the Blaney years on discussion of Asian immigration, and I remember being called by a parking officer once at a TAFE college as a slopehead. And I didn't know what a slopehead was. I had to go home and bring some of my Australian friends to explain to me what slopehead was. Now, since those days, and since the whole debate of Asian immigration during the Howard period, when that was all being questioned, I think Australia's come a long way, and Australia, I think, has grown up from that. I think Australia's realised that you can talk about immigration and the level of immigrations Australia takes in, but not in terms of race.
Tourism in Asia is big business. By the year 2000, tourist numbers to the Asia-Pacific region are predicted to double to 100 million a year. Even Vietnam and Laos have recently begun promoting themselves as holiday destinations for the adventurous. Despite the different cultures, economies and political circumstances of countries in the Asian region, there is a similarity to their tourist advertising. They promote themselves as exotic and beautiful, the people friendly and ready to serve, the accommodation and food cheap, and almost everything, according to your tastes, readily available. Asian governments, often encouraged by the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, see the foreign exchange earned from tourism as vital for continued economic growth. In Thailand, tourism is now the #1 foreign exchange earner. Evident in many parts of the country are the massive infrastructure changes which have been made in order to facilitate this tourist growth. New airports have been built, resort and tourist complexes dot the coastline. But behind the glossy tourist promotion, another picture emerges.
Tourism, you see, is something which was being imposed upon the people of Asia, not something that people themselves have asked for. It's something that governments have asked for, or business people have asked for, but the people of the country and the people of the village have never asked for it. They've in fact had to adapt to tourism. just as they've had to adapt to many other things like colonialism right through their history. Some people are adapting to it fairly well, but most people are not. They're finding it something that is changing the economic structures under which they live, that is modifying their culture, and that is changing the lifestyle and introducing things which are never there before. The most glaring example, I think, is mass prostitution, and now the very ugly phenomenon in many Asian countries of child prostitution. These are all things which have been directly a result of tourism.
All over Asia, communities have lived and worked their land for many generations, often without the need for formal title to that land. Now the expansion of tourist development has led businessmen and governments to see this land as a desirable asset. As a result, the livelihoods of many local communities have been changed forever.
The image of Indonesia of many Australians is Bali, and the image of Bali being presented at the moment is the image of the luxury beach resort at an area like Nusa Dua. In 1979, that was a simple fishing village. 200 families lived in that village. Their land was compulsorily acquired by the government, and they were compensated of something like 150 Australian dollars per hectare. It seemed like a lot of money to them at the time. And they were allowed to live on their land for a little while, until the government was able to lease that land on long-term leases to multinational development bodies, multinational corporations, who came in and they built their hotels. Now we find that local people not only can't live on the land, for which their compensation is long gone, they don't have access to the beach either. They can't go fishing. What can they do? They can try to sell souvenirs on the beach, or they can work as housemaids or gardeners in the hotel, if they're lucky. Otherwise, their whole livelihood has gone. There are countless examples like that one throughout Asia.
Although some anti-tourist groups would like all tourists to stay at home, others have adapted to the effects of mass tourism by maintaining control over who visits their temples and views their ceremonies. And other communities in Asia and the Pacific are adopting an eco-tourism model, one which they believe maintains their cultural and economic independence.
I think that you don't really convince the local community. I think the local community comes to you and they say, we would like to have some tourists coming here for reasons of economy or whatever. Maybe they have arts and crafts that they want to show or sell. I don't think it's a matter of tourism people going to that local community and saying, look, you've got a wonderful white beach, can I please bring some tourists here? Because that is the mass tourism model. It starts like that and it ends up, as we all know, in degradation, both of the environment and of the local culture.
While local communities throughout Asia have had to adapt to tourism, we as tourists need to be responsible in the way we travel, by investigating alternatives to package tours and learning as much as we can about our destination before we leave home. Responsible tourism can offer us a rare understanding of a world very different to our own. A recent survey reported that 77% of Australians believe that Australian aid should go to people most in need, even though there may not be any commercial benefit to Australia. Australian government aid to the Asian region totalled $427 million last year. More than a third went to the countries of Southeast Asia, where the aid program is increasingly shaped by Australia's own commercial interests. The government's aid policy states that there are multiple motivations for giving aid: humanitarian concern, foreign policy and commercial interests.
I think in general, aid to the Asian region is really affected by the problem with multiple motivations in the government's aid objectives. While they say that there's no contradiction between foreign policy, commercial and humanitarian goals, I think in general, when it comes down to making a decision about a project, what tends to happen is that humanitarian goals are left behind, particularly in the newly industrialising countries. Because the governments of those countries are following a very free market approach, it means that the gap is widening dramatically between rich and poor. There's a small minority of people which are certainly developing very fast, and it tends to be either foreigners or the government of the day who tend to gain through Australian aid projects. If you're looking at a country like Thailand, which has had maybe 10% growth over the last few years per year, a country like Malaysia, where the government's had a $5 million program going there, even though it's no longer a low-income country, it certainly raises the question whether Australia should have any aid. Different answers come up. One argument is that because there is still significant poverty in those countries, it is very important to maintain an aid program there. Another argument is that government aid is not going to actually help alleviate poverty anyway, because by definition the way that it works is that it really helps trade relations and helps people that already have. It doesn't actually help the have-nots to any great degree. So there is an argument that aid should be cut. But I think probably the view more widely held is that aid should continue, but that it should be redirected, and it should be, wherever possible, there should be much greater consultation mechanisms and greater ways for getting more equity into projects, so that it's not just a few people that benefit from them.
Recent examples of human rights abuses in the region raise the question of Australia's responsibilities as an aid donor and as a signatory to the United Nations Convention on Human Rights. Should we make a clear connection between our aid to countries in the region and their human rights record?
Australia has linked aid and human rights in certain instances. It's cut aid where countries have abused rights, for example, Fiji and Vietnam. It's raised human rights issues in forums of development of donor countries and recipient countries, for example, Sri Lanka and Indonesia. And on some occasions, for example, the Philippines, it has sought to channel Australian official development assistance through non-government channels. But what's lacking is a comprehensive human rights and development policy framework that would do certain things, for example, that would develop strategies for Australia as a player in multilateral donor institutions like the World Bank, the IMF, the Asian Development Bank, to have human rights concerns considered as an integral part of the international development process. The UN Secretary-General, I think, put it very well in his report to the General Assembly last year, where he said that human rights are essential components for sustainable development. Sustainable development is not possible without respect for human rights.
in 1992, a unique world gathering of environment, development and government representatives took place, the culmination of 2 years' preparation.
The United Nations Conference on Environment and Development, or Earth Summit as it's commonly known, brought together about 178 countries from around the world, and the positive part of it was that it put a range of environment and development issues on the agenda. Unfortunately, though, it didn't consider the major issues that many southern non-government organisations felt were absolutely central to solving their environment and development problems. And the key issues that they didn't put on the agenda were trade, the role of transnational corporations, third world debt, militarism, and also the role of the multilateral institutions such as the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund.
The Rio summit brought together some strange bedfellows. Malaysian environmentalists and the Malaysian government, usually at loggerheads over environment policy, found themselves in agreement. Both groups were opposed to the industrialised government's insistence that they, the northern countries, should be determining solutions to global environment problems. Their priorities and solutions were being determined in line with their own perspective and needs, and then thrust upon the developing world. On forest management, for example, the northern countries' record has been very poor, but now they were taking the green messiah role, telling the south they must reduce their logging.
The issue of forests was a very difficult and divisive one in the Earth Summit. The negotiations were particularly difficult, and certainly among governments there were differences between the southern and northern governments. Malaysia and India, for example, emphasised national sovereignty and the right of their governments to exploit natural resources within their boundaries as they saw fit. And at the other end of the spectrum, you had countries like the United States, which were really wanting to use third world countries as the so-called carbon sink to soak up the pollution which they had created. So there were differences between governments. There were also a difference of emphasis, not so stark, but certainly it was there between the southern and northern NGOs, where environment groups were particularly strong on wanting to see conservation of old growth or primary forests, and the southern NGOs stressing the economic dimension of the problem, poverty alleviation, and also the need to take care of the rights of Indigenous communities.
Here in Australia, the discussion and new alliances resulting from the summit proved to be a catalyst for groups working towards ecologically sustainable development. Australia's economic climate doesn't make their task easy.
Well, countries like Australia are highly industrialised, and we are relatively wealthy in spite of the recession, and it might be hard for people to understand, but we are relatively wealthy. And we use an awful lot of resources per head of population. And I mean, the industrialised world uses something like 80% of the world's resources, although it only has 20% of the world's population. So we're a part of that. And that means we have very, very strong obligations to make sure that really our own house is in order, that we actually we are operating our economy on an ecologically sustainable basis, and also that we are enabling other countries that do not have anything like our standard of living to gradually, improve their particular standard of living.
Although it is not conclusive that global warming will have a lasting effect on the world's climate, the consequences for countries in our neighbourhood could be disastrous. Some predictions suggest that there would be a rise in sea levels with the inundation of low-lying coastal areas and some islands. There would be greater climactic instability, more storms, cyclones, droughts and floods. Poorer countries in our region, like Bangladesh, would be unable to afford protective measures and would suffer heavily. Most environmentalists agree that a sensible course of action is to reduce our greenhouse emissions. As one of the industrialised countries at the summit, Australia was a signatory to the Climate Change Convention, which committed us to a reduction of greenhouse emissions by 20% by the year 2005.
We actually have the third highest greenhouse gas emissions per head of population in the whole world. So we're in the dirty greenhouse stakes basically. We're in a very winning position, and that is totally unacceptable, because obviously developing countries are, need in fact to be starting to use more energy, and it's very difficult for us to be saying to them you must do it efficiently and use renewables and so on and not have very high greenhouse gas emissions if we in fact are going in exactly the opposite direction and not pulling our weight in that area.
From the first days of Australia's birth as a nation, we have seen ourselves as a European country trapped by our own geography. Our foreign policy in the region reflected this.
For a long time, I think it's fair to say that Australia, or at least Australian governments, but perhaps we can say to a substantial extent Australian people, have, in shaping their relations, particularly with Asian countries, allowed the policy to be shaped to a large extent by fear. For a long time, as we all know, probably ever since white settlement in this country, there's been a great fear that somehow our standards, our way of life, our interests, our security would be threatened, undermined by attack, by threats, from one or other of the other major Asian countries, whether it be Japan or China, more recently Indonesia or Vietnam. The idea of the yellow hordes, the yellow peril, has been a very strong influence, I think, in Australian thinking. And maybe it has something to do with this, that after all, white Australian settlement was made possible by invasion. And there must be lurking deep in the white Australian psyche the thought that if white Australians managed to get here by invasion, maybe others could do the same at some future date. It's been a very strong, I think, influence over Australian thinking. In more recent times, of course, while that has declined to some extent, there has still been the view that if we're to be defended, given that we are a large country, the myth goes, and that we have a long coastline to defend, and that we have a relatively small population with which to do it, if we're ever under serious threat, then we will need to rely on great and powerful friends. That's been, I think, a second very powerful influence in Australian thinking, particularly governments. And for us, since the Second World War, that great and powerful friend has been the United States. And I think it's fair to say that it remains one of the great influences over the way Australia conducts its relations with Asia and the rest of the world. And increasingly, the third influence I would mention is that we see our economic future to a large extent shaped now by what happens in the so-called dynamic Asia-Pacific region of the world. And this to a large extent means primarily Japan, to a lesser extent the so-called Asian tigers, particularly South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore. And the feeling, I think, is emerging that unless we are able to conduct our economic affairs in ways which they regard as acceptable, then we're going to be in some difficulty. And so I think there is growing within the business community and to some extent within policymakers and governments the view that somehow or other our economic policies must be conducted in ways which are satisfactory or satisfying to the powers that be in those Asian countries.
In recent years, Australia's foreign policy has reflected our changing view of Asia as we seek to become more involved in the region. Although Australia has taken some commendable diplomatic initiatives, there are still some blind spots in our foreign policy, where economic and other concerns have taken precedence over questions of justice.
Well, human rights has emerged as a major issue, I believe, in Australia's relations with Asia. Human rights is going to be one of the key issues in the international agenda for the next decade and beyond. And it's probably fair to say that Australia has yet to develop a fully coherent and constructive policy on the subject. It claims to be very firmly, strongly committed to the implementation of all the basic human rights to which the United Nations and its agencies have agreed to, and Australia is a signatory to many of these agreements. But when it comes to the crunch, particularly in determining what its policy should be in many of the trouble spots of Asia and the Pacific, that's where there begins to be, unfortunately, a very serious gap between the rhetoric of our commitment to human rights and the reality of our policies. All countries, and particularly I think Australia, because it's so well placed, has a very important role to play in developing a more effective human rights regime. The reason why I say that is that Australia, first of all, is a multicultural society in its own right. It's bringing together a great number of cultures, a great number of philosophical, religious traditions. It brings, of course, Aboriginal, Indigenous communities and, more recently, white and Asian communities. And I think this is the kind of melting pot where we can experience, hopefully, the fruits of tolerance and acceptance of the human dignity of all the peoples and communities that are part of the new emerging Australia. And more generally still, the fact that we are, I think, if not an actual, then at least a potential bridge between the West, with which we still identify to a large extent, and Asia, which is part of the economic and political reality that Australia cannot possibly cut itself from, either now or in the foreseeable future. So all these geographical, historical, and cultural factors give us, I think, an enormous opportunity to play a useful and constructive role, provided we have the courage of our convictions and provided we have a sense of confidence that we can do it, not alone, but with others in the region.
Many of the countries of Asia have experienced great change in the area of international trade over the past few decades. The newly industrialised countries, Korea, Taiwan, Singapore and Hong Kong, have created rapidly expanding economies and are competing with the more mature economies. Some of the Asian countries are experiencing rapid rates of growth. their strategies involve diversifying their economic base.
Well, in many ways, commodity prices have been the key to all of Asia's development. In the terms of Asia's settlement was based on Western powers seeking out commodities, and that was the basis of the colonial network that was in Asia. What we've seen, and it varies from country to country, there's been a very deliberate attempt and a move by the commodity-dependent economies to make sure that they broaden their economic base away from the one or two commodities. For instance, Indonesia, quite clearly dependent on oil, and with the 80s oil slump, there was a very deliberate effort by Indonesia to move into other areas, now predominantly manufacturing. In terms of labour, if you see labour as another commodity, in terms of global economics, certainly business does, then what a lot of these countries have done, as the raw materials commodities collapsed, Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, they moved into the manufacturing processes offering the commodity of cheap labour. And by and large, that's been the key to a lot of their industrial development in the last 20 years, or last 10 years in particular. Now, countries like the Philippines are probably the most affected by commodity prices because their diversification was never as deep as the other ASEAN countries in the mid-80s for all sorts of political, social factors. Now, we're getting to a position now where while the Asian countries are still quite dependent on commodities, increasingly a large proportion of their exports are coming now from manufactured goods. The other question you'd say about in terms of commodities, particularly in the cases of Malaysia and Indonesia, we'll use them as an example, what we saw was an intervention of the state in the independence period to make sure that the control of the commodity, the natural resource, was in the state's hands. In terms of oil, which is one of the key commodities of both Malaysia and Indonesia, that was a national oil company, in Malaysia's case Petronas, and Indonesia Pertamina, where a strategy of controlling that resource for national benefit was instituted. And similarly in other areas, where say for instance rubber in Malaysia. And I think that's another important development strategy that the ASEAN countries have had. So while I would say that they are still dependent on commodity prices, and certainly some more than others, by and large the 80s strategy of diversifying away to some degree has been quite successful.
Rapid export-oriented growth is creating major changes in the social fabric of the newly industrialised countries. The middle classes are an emerging economic and political voice. Similar changes are occurring in the other growing economies of Southeast Asia.
The social questions are going to be the crucial questions in the 90s. What you've seen is an economy run far ahead of everything else. In terms of infrastructure, just electricity, of telecommunications, there's an enormous bottleneck that's emerged in Asia. And in the next 6 years, the estimations of investment that is on the drawing boards and probably going to go in the next 6 years is 550 billion US, which is an enormous figure. So, you know, you've got the infrastructure questions which have to be met. I mean, sitting in Bangkok traffic for 7 hours in a day is a disaster, or power blackouts which are happening in Indonesia, Malaysia, or the Philippines. The second question is the question of the inequality of wealth. Now, what you've seen in this industrialisation is an incredible elite within the indigenous societies that have become incredibly powerful and rich. Now, what you've got is this very uneven distribution of wealth and this rapid growth of wealth which has caused a lot of social tension. Now, in the newly industrialised countries, Korea and Taiwan, to some degree they've had to have a safety valve of politicisation and democracy to let off the steam that was building up in those societies. Quite obviously that was the case in Korea, which in my view from 87 on had almost an insurrection in terms of working class power and increasing their rights within the society. Taiwan to a lesser degree, but certainly the conditions have improved quite dramatically because of the political pressure that had been mounted by workers and middle class people as well around environmental and social issues. Now in the rest of Asia, this process is now unfolding. Most obviously in Thailand, quite interestingly, when the military took over, tried to reimpose a more brutal style of development, stopping all trade union activity, there was, as we all know, quite a upheaval which, while it didn't put the military elite right back in its box, certainly set them back a fair way. And I put to you, in the rest of Asia, this sort of social tension will be quite important. In some ways it's a parallel to Europe in the 19th century, where you have an economic development and change which changes the class structure of the society in terms of a new working class, a new urban middle class, then you get the political and social ramifications that follow on from that. And that will be the most important events that will affect our lifetimes right across the Asian region.